something. So we're here again. It's Ty and Gabe and I today. Super Bowl Sunday. It may be a little less traveled this meeting today, or this discussion. I don't know why this early in the day that would be the case, but I'm not going to try to figure out what people are doing. But I'm here with Ty and Gabe, and one of the questions that came up a few weeks ago about self-will, freedom of choice, I think there's probably other words to describe it, is something we've been discussing, because there are obviously things that we do not choose that are not choosable, and an absolute reality would be one of those things. If there is such a thing as something that's absolute, that is not in space and time, that would suggest the other dimensions that we talk about that are beyond the fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh dimension. I think they're up to how many dimensions do you?
I don't know, 14 or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought it was 13 or 14. Whatever those dimensions are not limited to this concept that we tend to live with, seemingly live within. And if that exists and is something beyond this realm, then choice is something limited to the realm of limits, options. Whereas those other things would not be options, they would not be negotiable, they would simply be a state of being that isn't, that doesn't begin, it doesn't end. And if that's the basis of our thinking, then we are free, obviously, to think it isn't the basis of our thinking. And to that degree, we've got a pretty broad swath of freedom. And I would say love gives us, if we've been given everything based on the fact that the source is infinite, then there is nothing more we need or can have. And the only ideas we have about such things are coming from ideas that are wrong about that infinite source. Not to say we don't have needs on earth, but within addiction, it's not talking about things we need. It's talking about things we think we need that are killing us, not just deep breathing and good food and good water and friendship and social connections and all of those things that tend to help humans survive. But we're talking about needs on an addictive basis that actually seem like needs, seem like all we need, and end up being the thing that are toxic and poisonous and contaminants and corrupt and lead to behaviors that undermine our capacity. And I'm talking from beyond recovery from a symptom, talking about the daily life and the history of humanity in terms of how we all dysfunction collectively and can war and think of it as something happening over there somewhere else and not have anything to do with it. If I have that thought, I'm actually promoting the idea that it's okay because I don't pay attention to it. It's as though it's not happening. And I don't have to be immersed in it either and drown in it to simply acknowledge that somehow my lack of influence is allowing things to happen that seemed pretty absurd and insane. So if the basis of my thinking is such that I choose to think there's nothing greater than my thinking, and that isn't true, I would naturally be defensive and reactive about trying to maintain that idea, because the only basis for that idea would be more and more thinking, which would pretty well define mentally obsessive thoughts. The ability to think we're being thoughtful when in fact we're full of this intoxication of thinking about thinking about thinking. As though it's a source, as though it's an end, while it's constantly, chronically being repeated and causing effects that are very disturbing and very discomforting, and very dysfunctional, and all of those other things that the bedevilments would define, but also all of the things that humans do to one another that are not kind, are not generous, and are not supportive of an abundant view of life, but one that is very scarce and very fraught with fear and anger and hostility and contention. So part of that discussion yesterday was the idea that will is choice. We don't tend to make choices when we don't want something. And if we're making a choice, we're willing to make the choice. if the consequence of that choice isn't what we thought it would be, it shows the choice originally was a weak thought based not in reality, where application of it would naturally provide what was originally imagined, but some other lesser result would occur. And to argue over whether that result should or shouldn't occur while it's occurring is to, again, defend the thought that should have realized something other than what actually happened. So if we're free to go through that process and start to notice it's actually a guidance system and a learning curve and a potential for growth to adjust to what's happening rather than constantly reinforce what isn't happening, in terms of maintaining this idea that my own thinking about thinking that isn't right is true and is right, would cause great reactiveness and inability to confront what's actually happening. So processing reality is alcoholism. The allergy of alcoholism is an inability to metabolize sugar. We can't process alcohol. The mental problem is that we can't process reality when we imagine reality is only what we think of it, and end up being in a very reactive state, trying to govern that idea that has no basis in reality, because reality doesn't need us to think about it at all to be real. So in terms of the freedom, Gabe, I would say it's limited to that cycle of choice we're capable of making in the present right now, and it always includes not making the choice.
Then our choices aren't infinite. Or do you think we are?
Well, ultimately, if we can make and not make the choice, it's kind of like if everything is changing and you look at the parts and pieces and it seems impossible to stop them from changing, or it seems as though they shouldn't be changing because you're not looking at the whole, the one thing that isn't changing is that everything's changing. So when you look at things in totality, you start to see the freedom of that choosing rather than the contempt of thinking of it, or the condemnation that happens when we imagine it to be something other than it is. When you see that in the totality, then the freedom is that the possibility to even make choices is coming out of the potential of an infinite source. This expression of possibility that we're living is simply an expression of a possibility of what life can be, of what life is able and capable of expressing. And if we're falling short of an expression of that life that would be valuable and great, we're feeling worthless and not grateful for the experience we're having, because we're not expressing the greatness of that potential. We're expressing simply the limited thoughts of who we think we are, and thinking that then we become those thoughts, and now feel like we're drowning in thoughts rather than observing those thoughts and seeing there's something we're actually doing as thoughts, rather than actually creating reality. We're manifesting effects that accurately reflect the thought. So if the feeling is bad, I'm having a thought that's bad. And it's the content of the thought. It's not thinking we're struggling. Thinking is designed to help us survive and navigate this dimensional scheme that we're in, or this sphere that we're in. So it's my thinking about thinking being reality that starts to, at the core of my experience, starts to create a reactive nature that does not adjust well to things I don't expect or things I don't think I want. So I'm fighting along the way all things and everyone in some way, hoping they'll do what I think they should be doing, rather than begin to notice they're always doing exactly what they're doing. Start to have a relationship based on a foundation that is accurate rather than one that is mistaken. Is the it's division between reactive and impulsive and compulsive behaviors versus a responsive, responsible consideration and action based on inspiration rather than desperation.
All right.
So if all choices are infinite and we're only making limited choices, the fact that we can make choices may be an indication of that infinite possibility. I would imagine the present moment is infinite in terms of possibility, because it doesn't seem to be, if something like the present is always new and everything possible is always possible in that newness, then the infinite is actually revealed in the present, which isn't actually in time, because if it's constantly new, it never gets old. So there's no continuum to base that on. So we're always in the present of what we can do. And if we do the best we can do, I would imagine it would be expressing the actual reality rather than this presupposed, predetermined, thoughtless reality, or a seeming thoughtful reality when obsessive thought begins and we think all we are is what we think, and largely because we keep thinking and thinking and thinking about thinking and think that that becomes ourself. Thinking of ourself is a term used to define thinking about thinking itself. I would think the bigger aspect to your question, Gabe, and this whole consideration is that we're always able not to choose. And that's the ultimate. If choice has to be chosen, it's not a choice. It would be an instinct, or it would be some automatic action that we're taking. Good morning, Jana.
Yeah, that's what some of the, I don't know what you'd call them, scholars, lecturers, whatever, take, is that our past experiences, our nature and nurturing has brought us to either a set of choices ahead of us or a single choice ahead of us that we are predestined to make, therefore not a choice. But
Well, that's a very interesting point. And I remember that guy I mentioned that I read about him talking about that and using that. But let me suggest something here, because what we're talking about, in my estimation, I've never read anything that really put, for instance, I listened through a book on tape coming back from Oakland recently by a Japanese Buddhist who wrote a very contemporary book on Buddhism. And in all the struggles that are defined, they don't seem to be thought of as an addiction. They just think of something we need to constantly do something about, like meditate and all that, to finally overcome. And the idea that this has been addiction through history is an interesting concept, because it sort of labels the problem as a problem that has collectively led to all of those circumstances and all of those occurrences, all those happenings along the way that we're right now, that are represented right now in the present moment. If you follow me, everything that has ever happened has led to this moment.
Okay.
So if I've defined myself as all those other moments, and as a result feel being here only gives me one choice based on the fact that who I have been are those thoughts along the way, I don't see this moment as freedom. I see this moment as condemned to all the previous moments. While right now includes everything that's ever happened, if in fact the newness of the present is always new and always present, then it means all possibility is possible. And I mean all possibility, not just limited to some predetermined ideas I've had, or predetermined ideas I had were the only ideas I could have, which would again be an addictive cycle. All of a sudden, the newness of the moment is always available. And the sick idea is that all I can do is the limited thinking I've developed over time, as though who I am is defined by those thoughts rather than the totality. My essence, being infinite as a being, would not be limited to thinking. Thinking would simply be limited to the ideas I think are limited. Very different transition there. And the basis of that is that reality would be our basis, rather than this seeming reality we create and the decisions we make and the ideas we can define and the narratives that we developed in our imagination. If those are all imagined, then they're just imagined. They're not reality. They're just It's like a dream when you're sleeping seems real. It isn't real while you're sleeping. It just seems real because you're sleeping. When you wake up, typically, if it was a nightmare, it's a relief because you realize, oh, it was only a dream. We spend the day awake and presume we're never asleep, when in fact, any of those thoughts that we're entertaining that aren't true are actually putting us in a coma, anesthetizing, desensitizing, numbing us to the defensiveness, numbs us to the idea that they aren't true, so that we can continue to maintain them in sort of that oblivion that seems to be self-control, when in fact the self it's controlling is simply a combination of thoughts we've defined as who we are. If that lie is the basic lie, then we've been fighting for a long time and been reactive for a long time and impulsive and compulsive. And violence, I would say, is a compulsive act at the extreme. The idea that I can use aggression and all of the chemicals that are released in my body, the excitement from all those chemicals, to justify killing somebody else or hurting somebody else simply because they don't think like I do or like we do, as whatever subgroup you want to.
All right, but let me pose a thought thing here. You're going to make some choices today, but those, I would say, those choices or options would not include burning down your house or hurting a child or other things. But you were saying those are still very, very possible options.
Well, certainly if you could bring them up and mention them, they would be options, right?
All right.
So it doesn't.
Realistic options, not just
Well, again, though, you're getting into realism.
theoretic,
If it's all possible, it's all possible. It's literally all possible. And that would also suggest that what isn't possible isn't possible. So if I want to go to the moon today,
Yes,
perhaps that's possible. I mean, maybe there is some realm at some point when time will not become a dividing, divisive factor, and all of a sudden you can just be there by. I mean, right now, if everything that's happening is happening, in essence, we're connected to that anyhow. We're not apart from it. We're actually part of it. So that idea that it's out there is just another idea of distance being used to suggest it is not here. But if we're intimately connected, we're all in all those places simultaneously in the essential aspect of our existence, while we are dimensionally thinking otherwise based on how our perception of where we sit with the eyes we have seem to have things appear. So it's just, if we can talk about it as though it's distant and feel impossible to get to, we could also see that it isn't distant at all when you begin to see that everything's intimately connected within the universe.
Yeah, I guess I come against that realism again. You're not going to the moon today, Jeff.
Again, though, if we're already connected to it, I wouldn't need to get there to be part of it or to be connected to it.
That's just semantics. That's just talking. Those are just words.
And yet, if the universe is seamlessly, indivisibly connected, which it seems to be, it would maybe, Gabe, it might be worth noting that that seamlessness does make this moment intimately connected with everything, everywhere that's happening and everything that isn't happening simultaneously right now. It's absurd, I get it. It's illogical, it's preposterous, but I would say if we've been basing our seeming life on a reality that isn't true, we've been insane trying to make sense of it and think that any sense made of it that actually makes sense would seem preposterous and insane to even consider.
Yeah, to me, that takes you back to the 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago thinking. Yeah.
Well, think of today. There's that some of that thinking from that many years ago is pervasive in many communities, and I would suggest while ours is new in many ways, we still have threads of that exact same thinking in our own culture to be doing the things we do that are not very kind and they're not really promoting freedom when we condemn people to only think how we think or else face the consequence of violence that we pose. I would say it's very much happening in our own culture, and we don't see it because it doesn't seem as blatant and as obvious as some other ones. But it is obvious and blatant because we're also part of those cultures. And what has been done to get those cultures or not get those cultures to a point where those cultures begin to see that those ideas may just have been developed by humans at points that they made perfect sense and don't necessarily make sense anymore. And they may have been developed by humans that never made sense and have been acting that way to make believe that much of that came from these ideas about God requiring those things of us. And that I don't suspect would be a loving, infinite God. It would be a man-made God with ideas that very much reflect humans' personalities: hateful, vengeful, fearful, contemptful, etc. So if we've gone so far as to make believe God is only what we think of God, it's not a coincidence that God seems to have many human traits, including the fact that we talk of God as a he, and that God does things and can condemn us and hate us because we don't behave properly. It sounds a lot like Santa Claus to me.
And has a will.
Yeah, has a will to hate. What would be lacking and needed within a concept of an infinite source that knows everything and has everything and is everything? Much less has and knows. It would be everything. There would be no shortfall there to try to make up for, no defensiveness needed, no thinking, as a matter of fact. That knowing is seamless. And if that knowing is seamless, I would suggest it might be worth admitting that is our basis for existence right now, here, each of us, all of us, collectively, seemingly independently or individually. And to begin to consider that doesn't require thinking at all. It's a complete surrender of thought to the idea that thought's going to ever get us there, because we've been obviously, if we think we have to get there, we've been obviously thinking we're not there. And I would say what's not there in our present thinking is an idea that has any basis in reality. And we feel it by feeling like we're not there, we don't belong. What doesn't belong is the thought that has no basis, trying to become the basis of reality, within the context of reality already being the basis of reality. That's just illusion. It's an illusion presumed to be reality. And it seems preposterous that this could be so simple. I mean, at least in my experience. And yet, until this century, last century, there was no real cure for alcoholism that was broad and free and approachable and capable of achieving results that had never been achieved. Doesn't mean everybody got sober, but it means a lot of people got sober, and it means a lot of the people that didn't get sober originally eventually got sober. Took them a little time for the water to seep through the limestone of all the ideas they had and all the presumptions and all the fight and all the reactiveness. And all of a sudden, people got sober, and not just in alcohol, but food and gambling and debting and sex and all the risky behaviors. 150 plus programs, 12-step programs. So if that can be the case, and the world can be seen as something that has embraced that to the degree that it's been embraced, certainly the underlying issue that is mental, as Bill described, might be worth looking at as being contaminated by a simple idea that thinking is our source, and that thinking more about thinking, which would be thoughtful in the thought F-U-L-L way, but not thoughtful in the considerate, responsible way that we talk about. And consideration includes meditation and contemplation. It includes giving thought to something, literally, so that our thought is accurate about that thing we're giving our thoughts to, and begin to also notice that that thing is whatever it is, regardless of what we think. And it's the same with this idea that reality is reality, regardless of what we think. It stops the idea that we need to think obsessively about it to get there, and starts to allow the relationship to reality to begin without the reactiveness and the impulsiveness and the compulsiveness driving us to not be able to sit still long enough to say, oh, that must mean now. That must mean here for humans. I don't suspect it means here and now for a spiritual being, but for our human being experience, it is here and it's now. And now here spells nowhere. So it even plays with this time and space configuration. So it's sort of everything and nothing simultaneously. And if there weren't nothing, there would be no place for everything. So looking at the whole, you begin to see that everything seems to interact when you look at everything a lot differently than when you look at the parts and pieces and think that somehow you'll straighten them out and then feel a little overwhelmed by trying to get every single one of the parts and pieces straightened out, when the closer you look, the more and more parts and pieces there are. So we can get microscopic or telescopic in our view. My sense is when we start looking at things as absolute, we start straightening our thinking out quickly, and the instability of thinking naturally starts to melt. Even to consider it without even understanding it, without even hoping for it, without even believing it, without having any faith in it, just to consider that an absolute source is absolute, meaning that none of us can be exceptions to it, nor can any of our thoughts be exceptions, starts to define the exceptions as illusory, generated imagination being taken for reality. And that would be a major conflict if that's the basis of what we've been doing. And I would say that human history is very good evidence of that conflict. If we're looking at it honestly, if we're looking at it completely, rather than only in relation to my neighborhood and my house and my yard and who's been violating my rights, versus seeing all of us in any way violating everyone's right to rightness. Right in reality has no fight in it because it doesn't have any potential risk in it. There's no doubt in it. There's no uncertainty because it doesn't, first of all, think. So it certainly doesn't think about itself and then determine that the thinking it does about the thinking itself becomes itself and has to fight for that reality. And that's effectively what humans have done with what we call now ego. That used to be the devil, and perhaps there is that spiritual entity in the universe. But if it is based on a lie, it has no power whatsoever. Only the power we give it, only the power we imagine it has. And in imagination, if it's delusional, it has absolutely no power, while we're suffering from the nightmare because we haven't woken to that fact or that concept. So rather than imagine all possibility and whether we can make all those choices, the real freedom is noticing that if the basis of my thinking is inspired, I start making choices in the present where I can make choices, where everything happens, that seem to be a lot more inclusive of others and a lot more useful to others and a lot more beneficial to others, because I'm starting to engage in a reality that I share with all others, rather than the one I think is my own and they have their own and I can't possibly get across the bridge to theirs, so I have to fight for them to listen to mine and go through that whole sort of process. Morning, Mark.
Morning, group.
So, Gabe, I think when you started this, one of the thoughts was, if I remember, well, you repeat what it was that originally struck you when we first started talking.
Like years ago, a year ago.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a one sentence. Just try considering that your thoughts may either not be real or may be lies.
Yeah. So
I never even considered that possibility.
all right. Well, so think of the thinking that would go into never considering that as somewhat reactive and protective about thoughts that actually define that, right? Living in a seeming world that seemed exclusive to the idea that thoughts were simply thoughts and they were imagined and they weren't defining reality. They were defining what I was thinking, what I'm thinking, what you were thinking.
Yeah, they were an absolute source, Jack.
Yeah. Well, that sole reliance on them gave you that impression, and that's exactly what mental obsession is trying to do. It's trying to say that if I rely exclusively on thinking as my source, because it's all I think about, that's all that there is. And if that concept is limited in any way, that means the limits of that is not defensible. First of all, it's impossible to turn a lie into truth.
It'll be good. It is. It is.
We've been through it.
Mark, I'm going to mute you. If we're defending the limits of those thoughts, all limited thoughts need defense because they can't be limited ultimately. And the difference is that we see everything beyond that as non-existing, like the idea that you never considered the thought. There's nothing in existence beyond that because we conveniently start to only think what we're thinking is truth and reality. And we think anything beyond that thought is heresy and actually threatens us, actually is an imposition and a threat against us. That's where that seeming self-centered fear comes in. It's thought-centered on thought, that when we think is who we are, we think the thought's in the center. We think ourself is in the center of those thoughts, which it isn't. It's just thought thinking about thought. So self-centered fear is really thinking-centered fear when we start making believe the thinking we're thinking is in fact truth and reality. We think we're the creators of reality and start looking around and things don't look very good if we're the creators. There's a lot of people that need to change their thinking to align with our thinking, a lot of things that need to happen to align with our thinking, rather than see that we absolutely have a knowing nature. And this goes to Mark, his recent point, I think he said on the beach the other day, that when he started considering the absolute, it's shifted his awareness. And Mark, you can continue if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I can acknowledge it, but I am right this moment struggling with that, even as we speak, of accepting it. And I'm just in a lot of pain right this moment. Regarding that and my thoughts being reality and returning to, so I just need to listen right this moment. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning that. So I'm going to speak to it because my experience was, and it seemed, Gabe, that we discussed this also when you started considering that, is that as you begin to notice the basis of reality is the basis of reality, and that reality is the basis of reality, rather than thinking is the basis of thinking and who I am and reality and all those other things, and that an absolute nature exists, a lot of rumors that I used to have about what God meant and what I should mean as a result of what God could and should do as a result of who I thought God was started to dissolve. And I realized that I was starting to actually see clearly the thinking I was doing that was wrong, and still blaming God for it not taking it away as though God ever put it there. So as I began to get clear, I began to see that I was doing things that were clearly being motivated by my own thoughts about my own thoughts that were reactive because they weren't true. And I used to think my job was to put the fire out of every one of those thoughts. And then it occurred to me that if the absolute is absolute, none of those thoughts are anything more than the idea I have right now about them as though they exist separate and distinct from this moment. All they are in this moment is a thought. And if I've been doing it for 100 years, there is nothing more to them than I'm doing now by thinking of them as something with a past that's 100 years old. That means that somehow they're so buried in the past that I can't possibly pull them out of a past, that I'm developing a narrative around to make believe they have reality again. I'm starting the whole process over again. I've been on that train and on that cycle so long that I'm very deceptive in my attempt to make believe I'm not doing it, while I go back and start to redo the whole thing all over again, over and over and over again. I wonder why I need to meditate more and run more and, get my endorphins higher and feel better and, constantly trying to work my way out of it, while I'm constantly maintaining it in some regard. And I still do. I do not suggest that I don't do that. And to any degree I face circumstances that I feel are overwhelming, I'm often and almost immediately triggered in some way to react in ways that would be historic rather and hysterical in the present, based on the historic nature of my thoughts, thinking of them as something real. There's a lot of cultural stuff. There's a lot of genetic stuff that seems to be impossible to imagine ever confronting, but I would suspect and expect and suggest that our present is confronting all of that, And the only limitation to that confrontation are the ideas that I'm trying to preoccupy myself to defend against the enormity of that, because pretty much everything and everyone I ever had any thought of would be diminished and wiped out by actually admitting that, because that thinking I've had about life is not true. So it's just another level of the same thing, starting to recognize that I have no obligation to react, and yet the reaction seems to happen without any thought. So you can see how thoughtlessness plays into the thoughtfulness of mentally obsessive thinking. We don't even think we're doing it, which means we're thoughtless about it, and yet we're full of thoughts, constantly trying to fix the thing we say we're not doing or don't think we're doing, instead of beginning to notice that the sum total of my present experience, just as the book says, if I am disturbed, no matter the cause, something is wrong with me. And he's saying no matter the cause, because he's saying the cause isn't out there, it's what I'm doing with my thinking. And I would say it's not me that's wrong or disturbed, it's my experience that's disturbed as a result of the thinking I'm choosing to do that's disturbing. So that clarity in addiction, the idea of getting over something means as soon as you recognize it, damn, it's over, it's done, I'm never doing it again, I don't have anything to do with it, I'll never repeat that. Not actually so. And it's never been that way. The fact is, if it's all delusion to begin with, we're not even doing it now, except to the thought we're doing it. And to begin to live on that basis consistently, those thoughts will dissolve literally, because they will not be a problem literally, because the only problem has been the idea that they're actually real now. To be suffering from something that's delusional is to think it's real now. There's nothing that exists outside of this present state. Nothing. Anywhere. It's all memory. It's all just ideas, thoughts. Lies don't exist outside of thoughts. And animals, being largely instinctively based, don't tend to think about their thinking, so lies seem to be limited to those species that can think about their thinking. And I can think of only one species on this planet that does that. So we, as part of that species, might be more valuable in our discussion focusing on that aspect of it, because it would affect the entire species and every other species as a result of the actions we take in relation to everything and everyone. To begin to look at this honestly is to begin to get thankful and grateful for the opinions or the ideas we're getting about the opinions we used to have that are destructive. But we didn't used to have them. We're actually presently having them, thinking of them as something we've done so long we can't let go of. And that they really define us when they don't. They just define our thinking. And if our thinking is happening right now, we have no obligation to continue thinking that thing. Back to Gabe's point, the possibility of it is endless. The idea that it's all we are gives us the idea it's all we can do. And that's exactly the addictive thought that has historically, even in the academia and science and all the different divisions of science, has been held to be true. It isn't. When scientists look back in time, they are actually only ever doing that from the present. They are not seeing backwards, they're seeing a present state from a present state of a present state. However it is now is how it is. However we define it and take the words to use as seeming distinct from our time period, it's just a way that we're talking about it, a way that we've developed to think of it. It's never seen from any other viewpoint but the present. Nobody's ever gone there to be back there and then needed to live that many more years to get back here. Because that can't be done anyhow, because time, I would suggest the present isn't in time. It's infinitesimally so small as to not be actually recordable as an amount. So it must be where we are as we are in the totality of that freedom. So to think the only choices we can make are limited to our human experiences, to once again think our thinking about reality turns us into only what we think, and then think we're stuck in our thoughts and have no perspective to see anything beyond that, including the fact that the basis of that false reality is also actually reality. Not in some divisive, minimized, rationalized term, just as it is. And so the struggle, Mark, that I had, you had talked about it yesterday a little bit, was coming to terms with something that was absolute, was beginning to see that it's just whenever I'm thinking about all those other things that are plaguing me, I began to just notice that what's absolute was absolute that whole time. And it's always been that way, no matter what I thought of it during those other present moments that I was witnessing it. And none of those previous moments that aren't actually happening now, except that the newness of the now is in fact that same moment. All those ideas I have are just more ideas about thinking being reality and seemingly imposing itself on reality when there is no imposition possible on reality, because it's always been real. It's real in an absolute sense. We can't have any effect on it whatsoever, but the effects we manifest, we think are reality, because thoughts are thoughts cause and manifest effects. So again, we feel stuck in that churning.
How do we get out of it? With if all we have are our thoughts.
Well, it's to simply see thoughts as thoughts and realize you've never been in them. If it's delusional and insane, the waking up is seeing that what's insane doesn't even exist, except to the thinking about it that continues to insist it persists. That's the only thing that's there. That is the addiction to thinking. And the idea that we're going to fix it and control it and get over it, again, presupposes or simply supposes, look at the posing in that word, poses that it's reality, that there's something to get over, that there's something to fix. There isn't. To start to realize that insanity is an opinion. It's not to say that people aren't suffering from chemical imbalances and things that have been passed on that are absolutely cause their experience to be seemingly unrelated to reality, but I would say it's absolutely based in reality. They're just not functioning very well within reality. But we're not talking about here. We're talking about something we do, self-imposed, self-induced, by a self that is simply thought thinking of itself that we have taken for granted becomes our self. And that's why we feel stuck in thoughts and don't know how to get out of them, just as you just described. We use that language as though we're really stuck in our thoughts when our thoughts were given us to help us survive, not to figure out how to kill ourselves. And compulsions are all acts of suicide, all suicidal tendencies. None of them were never compulsive about anything healthy, ever. There's no broccoli eaters anonymous.
So I feel like I get healthier, and I'm recognizing, and that my thoughts are reality is absolute from my thoughts. And as then I put myself, as I did today, right back into the place that triggers me to have those thoughts, thinking that, oh, well, I have, it's just thoughts, Mark, go walk through this. It's just your thoughts. It's not reality. And I put myself right back into places that trigger me to have those thoughts.
Well, let's say you're not putting yourself back into them. You have clearly continued to maintain those ideas, even though you're beginning to get a glimpse that there's a horizon and that the horizon isn't the end of anything, but the beginning of everything. There's still an undercurrent. My sense is that we don't struggle with what we think we're thinking. We struggle with what we think we're not thinking. And to the steps point, Bill talked about look for causes and conditions. He's talking about motivations, underlying motivations. What would be underlying things, but things we don't think we're doing or things we don't think we can see? But I guarantee you the one thing we can see are the effects of those thoughts. So if you start looking at the effects as you're as a reflection of your source, you'll start acknowledging the thoughts being the problem of those effects, and you'll connect the dots. That's all that it takes. You just start seeing, if I'm disturbed, something's wrong with my thinking, period. The book says something's wrong with me because we presumed that our thinking is ourself, historically. But just begin to say, oh, something's wrong with my thinking. And it's accurate enough. And what's great about this is you don't need to think of any thought to begin to realize that the disturbance applies to all of your thinking. Again, to the point earlier with Gabe, if we're looking at the individual ideas within an infinite context, it seems impossible to ever do everything we need to fix it, rather than start to see that if we're seeing it wrong and only admit that, it's fixed immediately because it wasn't anything other than the idea that our thought, like you're talking about my thoughts, your thoughts, are creating it. But what's interesting, Mark, is that we, while we have our own thoughts, all have the potential of doing this exact same thing with all the different thoughts we each have. So all the differentiation between the thinking we do is all of a sudden absolutely unified in the fact that we're all capable of mistaking our thinking for reality and suffering the exact same consequences in all the various ways that we do. While it may look different, it's absolutely grounded in the exact same problem, a lie attempting to be true. My idea that reality is what I think, and I'm going to think more about it and make sure that I get what I want to prove it, when in fact that proof very often people achieve after years and years and years of work, and they get there and say, this isn't it. Often leads to suicide. They finally arrive. They finally get it. It's not it. Why? Because they've been imagining what they had in the present was somewhere else at some other time that they would eventually achieve. And to think that is to think that that thing is not here now. So when you arrive at that now in that seeming then, it isn't there either. And it's very depressing to find out that the thing you've been trying to secure is now not any closer to being found, because the idea that it's missing is the problem. It's never, in an absolute sense, when you start considering what absolute is and looking at the definition of omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence and anything that would infinite, unlimited, starting to look at those definitions, you begin to realize there are no exceptions to those things at all, none. So you can't be one and your thoughts can't be one, and I can't be one and my thoughts can't be one. So if I act like your thoughts are one and I'm helping you with your thoughts to fix them, I'm actually helping you define further an idea about yourself that isn't true. And I now have become an ally in your own insanity rather than an individual who says, well, they're not true to begin with. How much time do you want to spend thinking about something insanely? And I'm not saying dismiss them and pretend they're not happening, but say, wow, if I'm doing this, it might be worth sitting with the fact I'm doing this because I've been doing it so long. The perpetuation of it is to think even the illusions aren't there. So that's it. They're not there anymore. They're not there and they're gone and all that, while we're still maintaining them at this other seeming level that we don't think we're doing. Admitting them and embracing them and starting to bring them into the fold and say, I am doing this. This is insane. And start to think in those terms allows our thinking to begin to actually align with reality rather than be maligned as our own reality and our own truth and this thing that constantly seems to haunt us. So the feeling of worse is actually getting better at feeling because you're starting to see how bad it's been that you thought it wasn't, because you were overriding it with all these other hyperactivities and compulsive behaviors, even within sobriety. By keeping moving, staying busy, being distracted, doing things that are fun, everything you can to keep your attention off the fact that there's a disturbance in you that doesn't seem to go away. So it must be, in my experience, what occurred to me is it's so fundamental, this idea about reality and truth being mine. There's just about nothing more corrupt I can entertain in my thinking to give my thinking the impression that it is in fact reality and truth, and induce this idea of conflict and reactivity as being my only source, because I need to defend that idea against everything and everyone all the time. And not notice that the big book is talking about that very specifically throughout the whole thing. We stop fighting everything and everyone. We're taken to a place of neutrality. As it says, as though we were placed there, not as though we got there, not as though we did anything to get there. We were placed there, meaning it just happens. We notice it. Oh, I'm there. Why? Because it is the place. It is the only place. It is the essence. And it probably isn't even a place if it's not in time. It's just an essence of an experience of something extraordinarily profound. And profound, if you think of the word, is for finding. Rather than seeking, now we've found. We're for finding now because we're thinking principled about what's happening rather than thinking unprincipled and immorally about things as only being what we think they are and fighting for a life that we don't even have. Because the life of those thoughts, if I'm fighting for them as reality, are undermining my body's ability to even function. All of my bodily systems are going to break down to some degree. I'm going to minimize my time on earth by making believe stress and anxiety is the nature of my existence and something I can't get over. All the excuses. Why would we excuse ourselves from something that if we didn't think it was something that was optional? This infinite state isn't an option. It isn't a negotiation. It isn't something that comes or goes that can be taken or left. It's the mistaken thinking about it that we struggle with. And if we've done it historically, it's no wonder we've wrapped a whole language around the dysfunctional ideas we've had and say things that are completely not true. And if you start watching your words, you'll see that you're thinking in terms that are very, very limiting and very conflicted. And yet we've rationalized. There's no reason for rationalization if we're reasonable. If we're reasonable, things are working because reason is being utilized for its purpose, which is to come to the best conclusion we can. And if it's wrong, adjust immediately in any way we need to continue to maintain the course of survival and the thriving nature of survival, not just existence at a bare level, at a break-even level, but a thriving, abundant nature that because everybody shares it and everything in the universe shares it. Every inanimate object that we think has no thought has a knowingness to be doing what it's doing right now, regardless of our ability to break it down and understand its interactions with all of the things. We don't need to be physicists or well-trained to notice that everything's doing what it's doing right now, and right here is that now for each of us. Silence, peace, stillness is the nature of that being because there is no change in it. There is nothing simpler than something that never changes. So all complications come from ideas about what changes that aren't true. It isn't a complication that everything in the universe that we're in changes all the time. Because when you concede that everything's changing, the absolute has revealed itself in that simple concession. They have talked about that since Aristotle and Socrates and all the gentlemen and gentle ladies that had considered what was happening on any level that was thoughtful began to notice that there were aspects of life that were pretty broad, worth considering, worth talking about. The whole basis of philosophy came out of that. Actual discourse, the whole idea of discussing things came out of that. Language developed around it. Academics, sciences developed around it. So they talked about it then, and we haven't come to terms with it yet, as far as I can tell. So our conversation isn't about not thinking, it's about starting to notice that how we utilize our thinking is the difference between a productivity level that is substantially greater and much more functionally literate than one that starts with a complete misunderstanding of life and reality and truth. Or what we call God, which would be all of those things combined, that supreme consciousness, pure consciousness, meaning undiluted, unchanging, the essence of essence. If essence is essential, it must be the essence of our essential nature, period. And I would suggest if it didn't exist, that failing and misery and depression would be high points for humanity because it would be our greatest achievement. Success and productivity wouldn't be natural in an environment where there was nothing infinitely productive. It would be rare and scarce, pretty much the way we've witnessed history. But it's coming out of scarce thinking, not out of reality that that's happened. If we've been able to abuse and use and overuse and still have some left, the nature of nature is pretty abundant to give us that chance. Just like gave the thinking that all we are and all we can decide in the present is what we are based on experientially, that's absolutely a possibility. But I would also say it's derived from the idea that all I am is what I think. So I've carved out the idea that all I can continue to think is more and more and more about who I think I am. Versus engage in that infinite, begin to engage my thinking in the infinite source by conceding the infinite source is infinite no matter what I think. And that might be worth writing down, Mark, and just sort of repeating that so that you can begin to see that your thoughts are very identifiable and the impact they're having on you. Seems all-consuming because you've literally thought reality was your thinking. When you start seeing that they're just thoughts that are causing that, you can live with that a lot easier than thinking that you're in them and drowning in them when you may be drowning in thoughts, because thoughts thinking about thoughts continually develop more and more and more and more thinking, which can be a little bit of heartache. But it isn't a heartache when you're thinking and letting thoughts think. They'll dissipate and disappear as quickly as they can come. There's a freedom there. There's a choice involved. There's a responsibility involved rather than this sense of being a victim and completely subject to something that we can't control and can't do anything about. If I think I have nothing to do with it and it's happening to me, the next thought is, I can't do anything about it. Next thought is, it's the only thing I can do, so I'm going to continue. It's exactly the addictive cycle. And it doesn't end with recovery from a symptom, but it makes clear the problem. Once we stop drinking, drugging, or whatever it was we were doing to give us the altered state that we were better, we start seeing clearly what's worse because we don't have that induced state of drug addiction, and yet we still have denial and our own bodily chemicals and the cocktails we're able to create in the intoxication with how we can manipulate our adrenaline and dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin and all the other things. They're all being manipulated by the anxiety and stress we create and or the peace we're willing to express. Morning, Philip.
As we talked about briefly yesterday about putting our higher power into a humanoidic state or being a humanoid, or in my case, fellowship, and returning to that fellowship and trying to tell myself that it's just, again, I'm in obsessive thoughts.
Yeah.
And it's at least for me easier to see that when it's a drug or an alcohol or this or that, except when it's around recovery and community and fellowship. And again, it's on me. I've put that into a humanoid experience. And, um, so I know there's lots of other fellowshipping and lots of other recovery, and I don't have to keep going back to that same, fellowship. Or when I say fellowship, I mean fellowshipping. Um, and I feel like I'm running and I'm not facing, and um, every time it just reignites that resentment.
So let's think for a second that maybe all of those feelings you're having are accurate assessments of exactly what you're thinking. Okay. And what's different in our brain, because you said, I can see it with the drinking, I can see it with all this other stuff. Those are tangible and outside of us. And we can't actually see our thoughts, but we can see the effect of those thoughts by how we see other things. And since this hasn't been talked about much, though in therapy and different forms of therapy, there is a process that basically is working toward helping people start to see the impact they're having on how they see things. But if you look simply to begin with, Mark, at the words you're using to describe your experience, I guarantee you would not be saying that 6 months ago. You would be feeling bad. You would be feeling horrible. You would be feeling dejected. You would be feeling resent. You wouldn't be thinking them as something you're doing. You'd be thinking of them as something you are. And you're literally admitting openly your observation of those things. And I would suggest to you that by admitting those things, you're starting to live with them according to what you're doing with them. And as you do, to the degree that you're honest about what you're seeing, they will begin to dissipate. But what will begin to appear are deeper ideas that you thought so beneath you, literally, that you had nothing to do with them. And watching that stuff can be extremely disturbing. But I guarantee you it will not be any more disturbing than continuing to load the charge that's building in your bodily system that will lead to some cataclysmic event that will not be welcomed. Some kind of failure physically. So the point is, if we're willing to sit with it and face it literally, it's like a face-off. We're literally looking at it not as the image of who we are, but simply something we're doing. So the face we've been putting on it has been it's who we are. We're taking that face off. This is really looking at anonymity, is seeing it as the basis of spiritual principles, because the principles before personalities means that principles exist without personalities, and that personalities are subsequent to principles. They're the basis of our life, the basis of existence, principles. And the facing of it or the not facing of it is how our personality, this thing we develop in terms of who we think we are, deals with it. So in mentioning it as you did, it's a very, very clear observation that you're having, that you're witnessing. And I would suggest as you see that and sit with that longer, you're going to notice it's something you've never really bothered to do, which is just to sit with the discomfort. And it's discomforting because you've been running from it for years, thinking you could outrun it and feel better about it. And when you start feeling it, it's going to feel as bad as anything you've ever felt. But it will also, the bonus here is that as soon as you start, it's going to dissipate, literally dissolve, meaning there's no problem there whatsoever. Once it's not resisted, the persistence goes away. The insistence to resist creates persistence. When we stop insisting that we fight it and try to get over it and try to feel better about it and try not to have it and try to rationalize it and justify it, why would we rationalize it if it was reasonable? There'd be no reason to do that. We only try to rationalize things that are irrational. We're trying to make sense out of them because they make no sense. Why not just concede it makes no sense to continue? And the freeness of that new thought is the actual awareness of the place you've always been, free, always had free, with an absolute knowing nature, always. And now you're choosing to act on its basis rather than the thinking basis that goes around and around and around and around. And it gets going so fast you don't think you can get off the merry-go-round. It's just too frightening to even think you can get off. But that's just a buildup of tension in your body that you're witnessing, that almost like a bully suggests the only thing you can do is continue. What I need to do is more and more and more. If you've been doing more and more and more with the idea that you were going to get better someday and you were going to fix it someday and you were going to turn it into truth, there's a lot of momentum in that thought, according to your thinking. So beginning to notice that the freedom of the moment, freedom, choice, and responsibility is the present. It's natural. And if you have free choice, think about it. We say we have no other choice. Why would we use choice if we had no other choice when it wouldn't be a choice if we had no other choice? It would be an instinct. It would be something we were doing. It wouldn't be something we'd be talking about or thinking about. Like our heart beating and the minerals and all the vitamins and everything in our system going through the blood and ending up where they need to be for the sake of the body's capacity to function. We don't do a lot of thinking about that. And yet it continues to work. And yet we undermine that in all the systems based on the thinking we do that's filled with stress and anxiety. And if we're filled with stress and anxiety and even feel it, we're causing it, and it's telling us. It's like a chalkboard curriculum for who you think you are and what that thinking about that who-ness that you think you are is doing in relation to your thinking. It's telling you that. And it becomes very valuable to see the lesson in that versus the idea of thinking it's something you need to get away from and stop. While doing that actually perpetuates it and creates it, and you just go into this endless loop. It's the living with it, the sitting with it, the embracing of it, just like a young child that just needs to be sat with for 10 minutes. Doesn't need to be told what he did wrong, doesn't need to be told that he's okay. None of it. Just sit with him. Ultimately, that's what our meditative state is. And I would suggest we're always in a meditative contemplative state. We just don't think we are because we run into circumstances that we didn't expect because we think everything, we've been so glued to our thinking so long, or seemingly, that we think all that should happen is what we thought should happen and what we wanted to have happen when we launched in the direction of what was happening. And the fact is, I guarantee you, if you want to meet all your expectations, begin to notice that everything that's happening is happening. And it's happening exactly as it's happening, not as I think it should, think it would, thought it would, wanted it to, insist it does. None of that matters. It matters to my experience dramatically when I think those things are true, but in reality, it doesn't have any matter at all because everything's doing what it's doing. And it's telling me over and over and over again, simply by witnessing it, that I don't have much of an impact on any of it. And the total impact I'm having is on my own experience of all of it. It's a very different way of seeing it than feeling it's me and reality's against me and I'm being attacked by a God that hates me and is vengeful. And hey, those are all descriptions of my own ideas about the self that I have that is so desperate and so out of control because it has absolutely no control because lies have no substance whatsoever. And our idea that they someday will is the insanity of making believe that we can turn something out, that we can create our own reality, that reality is somehow short that thought. And once we have it, reality will be reality once again. Reality can't be shy of reality to be reality. It's the sum total of existence.
I don't know. Right now, thinking about it, I think I'm more mad at myself. Or
well,
I know if there's a problem, I'm the problem. But
well, no, you're not.
That's not why I'm mad at myself. This obsessiveness that I'm going through right this moment,
yes,
is regarding not the original resentment, but I was talking to the person that was my sponsor at the time, and I don't mean to go into therapy here, so you can stop me at any time. And he had said something regarding that other situation, and I wanted to confront him on it, but I didn't, because I told myself it's just your thoughts, Mark. It's not reality. And I don't know. It started this vicious, obsessive circle, whole thing all over again.
So where in your thinking is that sponsor right now?
Like I want to go have that confrontation
You're having it.
within internally.
Yeah, exactly. See, when you said, I am wrong, you're thinking who you are is what you think, and the self you think you are is who you are. Rather than starting to identify that it's your thinking that's wrong. And the idea that something that happened, when did that happen?
Probably 8 months ago.
Okay. And you think it has to do with him, and he hasn't been doing that with you for 8 months, and you're still brewing on it, and you think it's about him and not what you're thinking about him.
No, I don't think I'm not mad at him. I'm not resentful of him. I truly don't. I'm
But you're resentful, as you described.
Yeah, but not at him.
Okay, so let's decide who you're resentful about.
I'm resentful at the person that a friend of mine who, when I was talking with him, and my sponsor said, "Oh, now I understand Jeff's dilemma." And Jeff was, and this is not. I feel like I'm going into way like therapy right here.
But Mark,
Yeah.
if you're thinking about something that isn't happening, where do you think the source of the resentment is? Other than you're thinking about it right now that's happening, where do you think the source of that resentment is?
Internally.
With your thinking.
Yeah.
It's what you're thinking about that's causing it. It's not who you are, it's just what you're doing. You're doing this, and you've been thinking so long, thinking is an action, preceding every voluntary outward action. And when the basis of our thinking is wrong and we think it's right, the lens of our perception is completely backward. We see everything in reverse. So we see it as the sponsor 8 months ago rather than the doing of what you're doing right now and the thinking you're doing. But you're starting to see this. And some of those things that you thought you had control of, that you were numb to, are going to start to show you that you weren't desensitized to them at all. You had just frozen the pain, but the pain was still growing. The frustration was still growing because the thinking was still being maintained in the exact same way, or in some various form that wasn't exact, thinking that because it varied, it was new. Well, the source of it was the same. My greatest resentment was thinking who I am is what I thought. Because everything that ever contaminated my interactions was based on that thinking. And all the wrongs I suspected others had done were my ability to make believe that it was them responsible for what I was continuing to do. And to begin to see that, I realized I'd used them all as excuses because I couldn't excuse myself. Interesting. The one self that I'm not, I couldn't excuse, as though its place at the table was just an absolute, secure, impenetrable condition that I was going to live with forever. Because I thought it was who I am. This is my reality. This is my truth. It's who I am. That's all I am. It's absolutely not true. It's something I was doing in thought, imagining it to be real. Period. So if my source is infinite, that's yours too, and we all share that. So to talk as though these stories are distinct is to use stories in the exact same way, regardless of the people and the places and the things we have in those stories. The faces change, the times change, etc., but they're all the same. They're just corrupt. They're all attempts to excuse what we're doing and make believe that if somebody else understands it, we have another vote on the board of directors, that we, in fact, have a self we're thinking about. There's nobody there but a thought thinking about a thought. That's all we're doing. Thought thinking of itself does not create ourself. It's just an idea we have. And the contemptful ideas we have about God are the contempt we have for the ideas we have, and we wouldn't be contemptful in our thinking if we didn't know better.
I guess I'm a little resentful or whatever. Also, that like they were talking about me. You know, my sponsor was talking with somebody about me.
But you see how you're looping back to the story?
Right, but it's not a story because otherwise it is reality.
Oh, really?
For him to say, "Oh, now I understand Jeff's dilemma." Obviously, him and Jeff were talking about this situation.
Okay, so talking is reality. So lying is reality, effectively. They're just talking about what? Think of what they're talking about.
They're talking about
their thoughts.
What?
About their thoughts.
Okay.
Okay, and you now are talking about their thoughts. And you're pissed that they were talking about their thoughts while you're talking about your thoughts about them now, freely thinking the problem is what they talked about, but not what you're talking about. You have the right, but they apparently don't. See the rightness in that thinking? There's no righteousness in right at all, ever. It's just right. It works. You don't have any conflict. There's nothing you need to pay attention to. It works. I'm not suggesting we can't construct these models, Mark. I'm not suggesting that what you're struggling with doesn't feel like it's what you're struggling with. I'm simply suggesting that if we're manifesting it, it's happening now. It's not about then, and it's not about them, and it's not about there. It's about here and now with us, everyone.
No, it does make total sense and complete sense to me, because I would say a year or so into my recovery, I had an epiphany, and I was able to put down every resentment that I had. And it was when I got out of jail, I was like, literally, I walked into a therapist's office, and the first thing I said was, "Am I a sociopath?" And she said, "Just simply for the fact that you asked disqualifies you." But I was trying to wrap my head around my actions. And I just, and I realized that, I didn't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, I'm going to go do this." Just my actions didn't meet my intentions. And the minute that I recognized that, I realized, like, oh, well, let's use like an ex-girlfriend who I was very resentful towards at a time, a resentment that I carried for a long time. I gave her that same benefit. I realized she didn't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, I want to hurt Mark today." It's just her intention, her actions didn't meet her intentions. Am I telling a story right now? Is it driving you crazy?
No, but I would say her actions didn't meet your expectations. And I would, in an absolute sense, I would say everything we do is our intention. Because if we're responsible by nature and we're absolutely responsible, we're actually getting exactly what we want, but we're claiming we don't because we're sick about the things we think we want, and we're not willing to be responsible for the choices we make that are completely deficient. We just magically think because we have an idea, it's just going to manifest in front of us in all its forms of our imagination, which is why failure is so easy. and feeling disgusted with ourself and feeling incapable, because we don't see that to do anything that involves effort is typically to do everything at every moment correctly to get there, not just wanderlust and wishful thinking. The wishful thinking is thinking that all I'm thinking is reality and truth. And someday, if I just keep thinking more about it, it's going to prove itself right, because I'm going to be realized as the God of all people and all things. I'm going to be seen as finally being the one in some way.
Yeah, co-conspirator.
Well, we see everyone as duplicitous because we're duplicitous in our thinking. We literally have a split personality in terms of reality being who we think we are, and we're wondering if we're schizophrenic. And I would say yes. If we're thinking who we are as a self, and I am thinking about myself, I'm identifying two people in my body, the I and the self, as though we're separate, as though we're distinct, as though we're something real, like the ego people talk about. Well, my ego got the best of me. It's interesting. The ego is a concept of a self that can't be real, because the idea of the way we use ego is a false image of self, or a reflection of how we think of ourselves. And if it's a reflection, that's not who we are. It's just a reflection of our thinking again. Just like a mirror shows us exactly what we're doing, our thoughts show us the reflection of what we're doing with our thinking. Those effects you're feeling. If you're central to that, it's the choices you make in relation to your thoughts that are manifesting the effects that you're feeling. So all the stories that have been developed are trying to rationalize that it was the only thing you could do because of this, that, and the other. When in fact, if you're doing it right now and you don't have any obligation, it's just simply the maintenance of an idea that's absolutely not true in the present, that's giving you all those other impressions that you keep maintaining so you can wrap yourself in a birthday cake and someday hope to pop out of it. I don't discount stories. I just suggest that there are moral stories and immoral stories, and there are ethical approaches and unethical approaches. And the idea of using them to justify that any less than 100% responsibility is our responsibility is to undermine our capacity to function and not notice the things we're doing accurately and think it's because of someone else and something else, somewhere else, and some other time. There is no then here. Now. And if then is then, it is here now. And there's no there, here now. And if there exists, it is here now. So you get both sides of the same coin flipped in the direction of everything being where we are as we are now. Everything possible is here. We haven't expressed everything possible because everything possible is still possible. And to Gabe's question about the infinite, I would say the infinite possibility doesn't mean we have to express it all simultaneously for it to simultaneously be possible right now. So it's all possible. It's already done. Now the question is, how do we want to express it in our human form? What do we want to turn it into? Rather than turn from it, what are we going to express that would replicate that knowingness rather than, or begin to manifest a rearrangement? We don't actually create things as humans. We just rearrange existing things. Matter is used to transform things. Not to create reality. The law of conservation says that all the energy and all the matter in the universe is static. It's the same all the time. It just transforms. A log burns and becomes ash. Slowly the ash turns back into some, whatever. We're transforming things. And we're in a transformative process as humans. But the present is always present. It's always new. It's always where all possibility is. And it's also where the accumulation of everything that has ever happened is happening now. Every step in every sand every bit of sand that hasn't been blown over by new sand is still where that step was made if it hasn't been changed. So all the effects we've created, we're living with in the present. There is no other place to go back to 8 months ago to find the answer or to fix. It's what we're thinking presently. If I'm thinking not correctly about the past, I'm going to be incorrect in the things I try to fix in the present. So I become a lot less sorry for everybody else I think I owe sorrow to realize they've already been sorrowful enough by everything I've ever done anyhow. I've already imposed it all on them. I don't have to be newly sorry to realize that all the effects I've ever had, everybody's already suffering, or everybody's already dealing with in some way. It may not seem significant, but if you take 8.5 billion people, you start to see the how significance can be derived because we're actually impacted by what everyone is doing rather than what we do individually. But if what we're doing individually is making choices that make no sense in relation to everything, we are not going to feel better very quickly. Or if we're going to feel things that are worse, and feeling better would actually be getting better at feeling those worse things so we can adapt to them and say, this is a guidance system telling me something's wrong with what I'm doing. I can continue to do it. I'm free to do it, but I can also stop for a second and look at it and say, is this the best thing to continue? And part of my freedom, Mark, came from starting to do the wrong thing openly and consistently with the awareness I was continuing to do it, rather than the blindness of addiction as thinking it was the only thing I could do. Now I'm doing it consciously, seeing that I'm doing it, committing to doing it, and within a short period of time, it made no sense to continue at all. The absurdity became clear because I'm not fighting it, I'm actually going with it. I'm actually filling the tank half with water and gas and realizing how poorly the car runs. And saying, you know what, I don't think I'm ever going to do that again. I'm not blind to it or pretending to be blind to justify continuing.
I still have a lot of work to do. I thought again, my thinking, that I had reached that point or the ability to tell myself, Mark, your thought isn't reality. And like I said, I put myself back into that situation and I reverted right back to it.
I do it all the time, Mark, every day to some degree. If I'm actually facing what's going on, I'm facing all the things I presumed were reality. I'm facing all the times and thoughts and moments that are accrued in my present, and starting to realize that whenever I'm feeling uncomfortable, whenever I'm feeling displaced, I'm feeling thoughts that have no place. I'm starting to feel those things I thought were buried and to adjust to them and acknowledge them rather than think I need to get over them and pretend going numb to them means they're not there, is the chance to actually become vital and say, wow, all I'm doing is what I can in this moment. I don't have to condemn myself for all other moments I haven't done what I could, because this moment gives me every one of those things that I think I should have done the opportunity to do right now. And if that's the case, I'm always in the face of it. I'm always present. I'm always able to do the wrong thing, and I'm always able to correct the wrong thing immediately. So to sit around for months and months and months, nursing it as though it's something that'll eventually get better, the harder and harder I push on it and try to be numb to it, is to undermine my entire capacity in everything I do, rather than just in relation to the one thing I think I'm controlling that's giving me this sense of prowess and control and ultimate power. It's all just delusion. So to the point you're making too, to give you a little solace in all this, begin to realize that your knowing basis has never changed regardless of all that stuff. All that changed was the way you thought about that knowing basis and who you were. That's all. Your knowing basis has never changed. It can't change. It's seamless. So it doesn't seem to be what it is what it is, and it's seamless because it isn't in bits and pieces. It can't be divided. It's indivisible. And how we see substance that is unseen is through understanding correctly, and largely we have been using misunderstanding as our form of understanding. So we've developed whole routines of thinking that seem to be the only way we can think, when in fact it's been a mistaken idea about thinking that's created those routines that seem so habitual. We need to fall into them and only realize, I just think there's a big gutter here that I can't get out of. The initial gutter now has become a valley, and I think I'm in a rut. I think I'm stuck. It's just a thought. Thoughts can't be stuck because they're always new. You can't be stuck because you don't even exist in terms of the thinking you do. And you can't be stuck as a fluid present being because everything's always new. What's the stuckness? It's always new. It's always new. It's always new. It can't get old if it's always new. That's why it's not in a time continuum. Meaning all possibility is always possible. It doesn't mean you can do those things you imagine, but if you can imagine those things, they can often be done until you're imagining impossibility is the only thing you are designed to do. That's what addiction is. We're trying to do the impossible. We're trying to turn thoughts into reality. And if that's the basis of my thinking, all those other little things I'm doing are built on that. They're all sort of sneaky examples that I'm using to try to cover up for that ultimate goal that I have of creating reality out of fantasy. What's possible becomes very evident because you start to notice it's simply what I can do right now. And then you begin to notice, actually, it's what I'm doing right now. It's all possible. And if I feel like things are impossible, I'm entertaining thoughts that are possible to entertain about impossibility. That's easy. Boom. As soon as I see it, Herb Kagan says, you spot it, you got it. If I can have it, I can let go of it. If it's only an illusion, there's actually nothing to let go of but the idea it's true. If I've been insane, I'm certainly not better maintaining the insanity. Because if I'm thinking about it as a past condition, but thinking about it presently as one that isn't existing, I'm thinking insanely about the present. Deep breath you just took. You know what the root of the word breath is? Spirit. And when we're choking on our words, we're suffocating. We're trying to minimize our capacity to warrant the justifications and excuses. We're trying to diminish our capacity and justify as being our only reality. That is called insanity. And it's self-induced and self-imposed by a self that doesn't exist, by the way, except for thinking of itself as ourself. If I am thinking of myself, I'm actually thinking of my thinking. Now I am in the driver's seat. The essence of my ability to choose and observe what my bodily functions are going to do. That's the I, not the me of thought. There is no me in thought. There's just thought about thought. And when I think it's me, I think I'm thinking of myself all the time. And I'm not. I'm thinking about my thinking. I'm thinking of my thinking. I'm talking to my thinking in my thoughts. All my thoughts have words attached to them. They're all narratives of what's happening, developing an opportunity to make good decisions, the best decisions I can make. And when the best decision I can make is to continue to perpetuate something that I'm not, I'm delusionally making believe I'm doing the best thing while I'm killing the body that I have because it is undermined with stress and anxiety. Why would we have stress and anxiety if we didn't know better? We would not. They're all conditions created out of our knowing nature as a guidance system to help us stop redoing and redoing and redoing and redoing. What we think is who we are, so we think it's the only thing we can do. And if it's the only thing we can do, that is not a choice. Again, It would be an instinct. It would be natural. It would be something that did not require thinking whatsoever, because thinking is all about choice. Thinking itself may not be about choice because it's what a brain does, but what we do with the thinking is to make choices so that we can act on those choices. And if the actions we're taking are built on corrupt thoughts, they're going to be corrupt actions, and we're going to say, I never expected this. How could this have happened? If we deny the thought, we're going to deny the consequence. And if we're doing it now, we're going to do it on a pretty regular basis. It's an addiction. It's an illness. It's self-imposed and self-induced, though. So when you begin to see the self that's inducing it and the self that's imposing it doesn't even exist, it becomes a little easier to laugh at the things you've taken seriously, including the thoughts that other people had about you, or you thought impacted you so much that you had to hate them for having them, when in fact the freedom you have to hate them is the same freedom they had to have those thoughts to begin with, something you share in common, not something that is distinct to either of you or them. And the seeming lines just melt. The division melts, and the indivisibility becomes the nature of this present moment. And it's an awe-inspired nature. We can choose from desperation of thinking about thinking, or inspiration of thinking about a knowing absolute awareness that is our nature. The book describes it. We will know a new freedom, it says. It doesn't say we'll rehash an old one. We'll try to take that thought from 40 years ago and try to bring it into the present. We will know a new freedom. Why? Because knowledge is always new. It's always present. It's always here. It's always now. There is no there is no then, other than here and now. And if there is a then and there, they're here now. So either way you want to argue it, it's present. As we are, it is. As it is, we are. We know, we're aware. We wouldn't suffer if we weren't. Suffering wouldn't hurt, because pain would be the goal rather than an odd confluence, seemingly odd confluence, that's telling us something is wrong. If pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth, it's because we continue to deny the pain and think we'll get over it and feel better about it that it continues. See you, Ty. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Go easy.
If we're thinking the old thing's going to get us better now, it isn't old. To even think of it as old is to miss the point of the present, and that there is no old in it at all. It's always new. It's always new. It's always new. If you ever wonder where you are, I remember Lisa, a friend from one of my meetings, used to say, look at your feet. We can't think we're not where we are if we weren't where we are to think that. Just like the therapist said, you can't be a sociopath if you ask the question if you're a sociopath. We can't be displaced if we didn't think there was a place we should be, which might be the place we're in while we're thinking we're not, or should be somewhere else with someone else with something else, which never seems to be enough when we start going down that path and don't notice that it's never enough because we're not trying to fill anything that has any substance. It's like thinking there's a vase and pouring water into it. I appreciate your insight, Mark. I appreciated it on the walk the other day too. I think you're witnessing this sort of transition and the integrity. Integrity is beginning to see the integration of things as things are integrated, rather than thinking of it only as truth and all that stuff. It's actually the integration of things, because the integration of things is truth. It is reality. And having integrity is functioning on that basis, because we've always been functioning on this basis, only thinking we weren't. If it's infinite, when we thought it wasn't there, it was there. We thought it wasn't there. It was the thinking that caused that problem. And if it wasn't there, we would have been elated by thinking it wasn't there and that there was no reality. Would have been the great success. We don't think that. We typically feel dejected and alone and despondent and isolated, disconnected. It's not an accident. It's not a curse. It's simply a consequence of thoughts that are despondent, that are disconnected from reality, that have no basis, that are alone because they have no place whatsoever. Even being alone would suggest that you're separated from everything. You can't even be separated from something if you don't exist. If the thoughts we have that are lies are just basically a perpetuation of an idea thought to be true, they have no basis in reality. Only the maintenance of our thinking gives us the impression they can be, will be, may be someday. Never now when everything's happening. So that is about it for our 2-hour conversation. Appreciate y'all being there. Thank you for dinner the other night again, Santiago. That was a spectacular meal.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I could tell by your own satisfaction how much you enjoy it. For real.
Did I tell you about the rehearsal of the dinner?
You mean getting ready for it?
The rehearsal, the cooking, what I was gonna cook.
Oh, yeah.
Because I apply what I learned in this meeting and what I learned with you. 2 nights before the dinner, I want to cook the dish that I was preparing to cook, to do a test drive. So this is a complex dish. It took me like 3 hours. And then finally, my test drive is ready. I've been attending to the dish in a small portion all day. And finally, I serve myself a plate, most everything because I make a very small portion. And I take it to the TV room to watch a movie where I eat. And I don't know what's happened. The tray flipped and it hit face down this beautiful Persian rug that I have that is silk and that I just sent to the cleaners 2 weeks before and spent $700 on it to clean. So not only my dinner is ready, is missed, and I don't know what the hell I'm gonna cook for this dinner party that I have because now I cannot taste it. The rug is pretty much ruined, and I am very hungry. So I catch myself into this very angry thought. And the thing about thought is that it's like a gate. If you engage with a thought, you open a gate into who knows what that thought is going to take you. And sometimes that thought takes you to just an uncomfortable place and you are in a bad mood and you are nasty with you and the people around you, but other times it can take you to suicidal thoughts and to suicide, So I catch myself saying, a gate is opening. So because everything is fantasy and everything is imagination, I said, wait a minute, what if one of the piece of meat had a cancerous cell that if I eat it, it will trigger cancer in my body? Or what about if it was too much grease and it will block one of my arteries and I will have a heart attack. I should be thankful that I am not that the invisible world, because for me, Jack, when something goes wrong, that is not my way, that is not according to the master of the universe that I am, I start questioning everything. That thought can take me to, well, as Jack said, either God is or is not. So God must be against me to allow this to happen, or God is not. And in both answers, you keep opening gates into deeper and deeper and deeper negativity. So anyway, but just by thinking that maybe that piece of meat was not going to be good for my body, I went down to the kitchen. I make myself an omelette, and I decided to change the dish for the party. I said, I'm not cooking this fucker anymore. And I was very happy to see that something that when I started attending this meeting almost 4 years ago, it was impossible. How the fuck I can control my thoughts? No, I cannot control my thoughts. They come and go. But what sobriety gives me is the space, the pause, to look at the thought and say, no, I am not going to entertain that. I am not going through that gate. So that's my experience with the weekend. And Jack, thank you for all the things you taught me here about the thinking.
You're very welcome, and I appreciate that you've listened, and I appreciate that that meal ended up what it was on the table rather than on the floor eventually. And
well, I cooked something different. You didn't taste what I was.
I know.
I changed the dish.
That the sauce was one of the best things I've ever had in my mouth. I mean, it was really, I thought a loaf of bread and that sauce would take me through many, many nights of dinners. That simple. It was really, really good. But to your thinking, what if you can apply any other thought? You know, what's within the obsessive thinking, generally the only thoughts we think are the worst thoughts that we can think. So we think about what happened as the only thing that shouldn't have happened, and then start to nurture that gate and go through. Now that gate's actually locked and we keep running into it, hoping someday it'll open up and give us the freedom and not notice that there's nothing there. So whether the rationalizations are actual or simply beginning to notice that you can think of things in any direction you choose, you start seeing how flexible thinking is and how quickly we are capable of not engaging in it as though it's reality and simply say what happened happened. I would suggest that the rug cleaner set a trap so you could get that rug back to them quickly. And there was a little wire there, little trip wire on that thing that when the guys brought it in.
Well,
but at least
I think that thought opens the gate of me taking revenge on the fucking Persian guy and maybe go, in the news.
The fact that we can laugh about it rather than cry over results.
Exactly.
Is the difference between taking a self seriously that has no basis and starting to see that the silly imposter we took so seriously was really just the court jester the whole time, acting as though he were the king.
Yeah.
And it's a joke. It's literally a joke. Now, the difference is when the jokes are on us and we really think it has to do with us, and Mark, I think you were describing this with those guys talking about you, you take it very seriously that somebody would have the audacity to have a thought about me while most of the time we're wondering if anybody's thinking about us. We don't want to not be thought of. We would like to be thought of by others, but when they think things we don't think they should be thinking, all of a sudden it's this contemptible version of ourselves because we're so imbued with this idea that who we are is what we think. We're not. We are not. We never have been. And the dissipation of all that stuff starts to become laughter. We laugh with tears rather than cry uncontrollably with sorrow. over the event. So Santiago, I applaud that. Being a Spaniard, I think you have a passion for what's right, even when it's wrong. And that that can be a very, I mean, I don't think bullfighting was created there because Spaniards are passive in their ability to express themselves. So, and that may be where the bullshit came from too, the whole concept. So anyway, I love you guys. I appreciate this very much, and I'm happy for you all being here. Philip,
Thank you. Sorry I was late to the
Santiago,
meeting.
Jana, Mark, Gabe, Ty, peace,
Thanks, Jack.
love.
Thanks,
Love,
Jack.
love. Bye-bye.
See you
Thanks
around
for
the
the. Bye bye.